In 1460, a monk named Leonardo da Pistoia walked into Florence carrying a Greek manuscript from Macedonia. 3 years later, Cosimo de Medici, the richest man in Europe, made a strange demand of his personal translator, Marsilio Ficino, put down Plato. Translate this instead. Cosimo was 74 years old and dying. He needed to read these words before he went. Within months, Ficino finished. Within a century, a man would be burned alive in Rome for believing what those pages contained. Then, on an April afternoon in 1460, Ficino set aside the complete works of Plato and opened a bundle of 14 Greek treatises attributed to an Egyptian sage called Hermes Trismegistus. The decision was not his own. Cosimo had given the order, and Cosimo was not a man who made requests lightly. He had spent 40 years building the Medici banking empire into the dominant financial force of Western Europe. He had bankrolled the Council of Florence in 1439, bringing Byzantine scholars west for the first time in a generation. He had founded the Platonic Academy of Florence. He was by any measure the single most important patron of intellectual life in 15th century Italy. And now, with months left to live, he wanted Hermes before Plato. The manuscript Leonardo da Pistoia carried south from Macedonia was not a single text. It was a collection of 14 dialogues written in Greek, attributed to a figure the ancient world had called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. In the cosmology of Hellenistic Egypt, Hermes Trismegistus was the Greek name for Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, magic, and hidden knowledge. The text attributed to him had circulated in the eastern Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years before Leonardo da Pistoia wrapped them in cloth and carried them into Tuscany. But in the Latin West, by 1460, almost nobody had read them. Fragments survived in quotation. Augustine of Hippo had cited Hermes in the City of God. Lactantius, the 4th century Christian apologist, had called Hermes a prophet who foresaw the coming of Christ. The name was known, the texts were not. Cosimo understood something about the manuscript that Ficino may not have grasped immediately. In the intellectual world of the 1460s, antiquity conferred authority. The older a text, the closer it stood to the original revelation, the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology that Renaissance Platonists believed God had given to humanity at the beginning of time. If Hermes Trismegistus was truly an Egyptian sage who had lived before Moses, then his writings were older than the Pentateuch, older than Greek philosophy, older than everything the Latin West had inherited from Athens and Jerusalem. They were the source. That belief, the belief that the Hermetic writings predated Moses, was the engine that drove the entire revival. Cosimo did not merely want an interesting read on his deathbed. He wanted access to what he believed was the oldest surviving record of divine wisdom on earth. Ficino completed the Latin translation in April of 1463. He titled it the Poemander, after the first treatise in the collection, in which a divine mind called Poimandres appears to Hermes in a vision and reveals the creation of the world. The translation circulated in manuscript before Cosimo's death in the summer of 1464. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Ficino, the printed edition followed in 1471. The book spread across Europe with extraordinary speed. By the end of the 15th century, according to the same source, it had gone through multiple editions and been read by every serious philosopher in Italy. What readers encountered in Ficino's Latin Poemander was unlike anything in the standard philosophical curriculum. The first treatise opens with Hermes alone in meditation. A vast presence appears, calling itself Poimandres, the mind of sovereignty. It shows Hermes a vision. First there is boundless light, serene and joyful. Then a darkness descends, coiling like a serpent. Then a holy word issues from the light and strikes the darkness, separating the elements. Fire leaps upward. Earth and water remain below. The whole sequence reads like Genesis rewritten by a Platonist. Light, logos, separation of elements, descent of the soul into matter. The second and third treatises develop the cosmology further. The human soul in the Hermetic account originates in the divine mind. It descends through the planetary spheres, picking up qualities from each one as it falls. Mars gives it aggression. Venus gives it desire. Saturn gives it slowness and forgetfulness. By the time the soul arrives in a human body, it has been clothed in 7 layers of planetary influence. Salvation in this system means reversing the descent. The soul must shed each planetary garment on its way back up, stripping off desire, aggression, ambition, and ignorance until it returns naked and pure to the divine source from which it came. This was not Christianity. It was not Platonism. It was something that looked older than both, and that was precisely its power. The fourth treatise, called the Crater or the Mixing Bowl, describes God plunging a great bowl of divine intellect into the material world and inviting all human souls to baptize themselves in it. Those who hear the call and immerse themselves gain gnosis, direct knowledge of God. Those who do not hear remain trapped in the body, ignorant of their own divine origin. The language is strikingly close to both the Gospel of John and the Gnostic texts that would be found at Nag Hammadi 5 centuries later. Ficino noticed the resonance with John's Gospel immediately. He took it as confirmation that Hermes had been a pre-Christian prophet. The later treatises in the collection range across theology, ethics, and metaphysics. The 10th treatise, called The Key, argues that the cosmos itself is a living God, a second God created by the first to be both his image and his instrument. The 11th treatise takes the argument further, insisting that nothing in the universe is dead. Even stones participate in being. Mind pervades all things, from the highest celestial sphere to the lowest clod of earth. The 12th treatise discusses the nature of mind and matter, arguing that mind is not confined to the body but extends through all things. That thought itself is not produced by the brain but received by it. The 13th treatise describes a secret regeneration, in which the student of Hermes, guided by a master, undergoes a spiritual death and rebirth while still alive, expelling 10 tormentors from the soul and receiving in their place 10 divine powers. The tormentors have names: ignorance, grief, incontinence, desire, injustice, greed, deceit, envy, treachery, anger. They are not abstract vices in this system. They are living presences that inhabit the unregenerate person. The divine powers that replace them include knowledge, joy, self-control, endurance, justice, generosity, truth, goodness, life, and light. Ficino read all of this through Christian lenses, and he shaped his translation accordingly. According to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Ficino, he treated the Hermetic text as a legitimate pre-Mosaic theology compatible with Christianity, part of a golden chain of wisdom running from Hermes through Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato to Christ. This framework, the Prisca Theologia, became one of the dominant intellectual models of the Italian Renaissance. It justified the study of pagan philosophy by recasting it as preparation for Christian revelation. It also gave Ficino a way to practice something very close to magical philosophy without running afoul of the Church. If Hermes was a pre-Christian prophet, then Hermetic practice was proto-Christian practice. The distinction was crucial for survival. The effect of the Pimender's publication on European intellectual life was immediate and lasting. Within a generation, ideas permeated Renaissance art, architecture, philosophy, and science. The concept of the human being as a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, an idea central to the Hermetic treatises, entered mainstream thought. The Hermetic image of the magus, the wise man who understands the hidden correspondences of nature and can work with them, became a Renaissance ideal. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, writing his oration on the dignity of man in 1486, drew heavily on Hermetic sources to argue that the human being occupies a unique place in creation, capable of ascending to the divine or descending to the bestial by free choice. Pico fused Hermetic philosophy with Jewish Kabbalah and Christian theology into a single system. He was 23 years old when he wrote it. Giordano Bruno took the Hermetic vision further than anyone else dared. Born in Nola in 1548, Bruno was a Dominican friar who left his order, wandered Europe for 15 years, and developed a radical Hermetic philosophy that fused the Corpus Hermeticum with Copernican astronomy and his own metaphysics of infinite worlds. According to Francis Yates's landmark study Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, published in 1964, Bruno did not treat the Hermetic texts as mere philosophy. He treated them as the remains of an ancient Egyptian religion that was superior to Christianity.
He believed the Hermetic revelation
preceded and surpassed the Christian one. He argued publicly, in print and in lecture halls from London to Frankfurt, that the magical religion of the Egyptians was the true faith, and that Christianity represented a decline from it. On the 17th of February in 1600, in the Campo de Fiori in Rome, the Inquisition burned Giordano Bruno alive. He had refused to recant. The specific charges remain debated by historians, but his Hermetic theology sat at the center of the case. According to the Wikipedia entry on Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, the trial lasted 8 years. Bruno is the man the hook of this story points toward. The pages Cosimo needed to read before he died produced, within 137 years, a martyr. If you are finding this useful, there are more stories like this on the channel. But the Hermetic revival did not die with Bruno. It continued underground, feeding into the Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, into the alchemical circles of Prague and London, into the natural philosophy of figures like Robert Fludd and Athanasius Kircher. The Hermetic ideal of a unified hidden wisdom running beneath all religions and all sciences remained a persistent undercurrent in European thought for 2 centuries after Ficino's translation. Then came Casaubon. In 1614, a Geneva-born classical scholar named Isaac Casaubon published a devastating philological analysis of the Hermetic texts. Casaubon was not interested in theology or magic. He was interested in language. He examined the Greek of the Corpus Hermeticum with the same tools he had used on Polybius and Athenaeus, the tools of textual criticism and linguistic dating. According to the account preserved in Roger Purr's detailed essay on the debunking, Casaubon demonstrated that the vocabulary, grammar, and philosophical terminology of the Hermetic treatises belonged not to ancient Egypt but to the Hellenistic period. The texts used technical terms from late Platonism that did not exist before the 2nd century of the Common Era. They contained ideas from Stoic philosophy and from Jewish Alexandrian thought. They quoted or paraphrased passages from Plato's Timaeus in ways that only make sense if the author had Plato's text in front of him. They were saturated with the intellectual atmosphere of the Roman imperial period. Casaubon's conclusion was plain. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus were not pre-Mosaic. They were not older than Plato. They were not ancient Egyptian. They were Greco-Egyptian compositions from roughly the 2nd and 3rd centuries, written by anonymous authors using the name of Hermes Trismegistus as a literary device. The Prisca Theologia was built on a chronological error. The dating has held. Modern scholarship, drawing on the full weight of papyrology, epigraphy, and comparative philosophy, confirms that the treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum were composed in Greek in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, probably in Alexandria or elsewhere in Roman Egypt. The Wikipedia entry on the Corpus Hermeticum summarizes the current consensus clearly. These are late antique texts, products of the same cultural moment that produced Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and early Christianity. They are roughly contemporary with the Nag Hammadi library, not thousands of years older. Casaubon's debunking did not, however, destroy the Hermetic legacy entirely. It destroyed the chronological claim. It destroyed the idea that these texts predated Moses and Plato, but it did not destroy their content. The philosophical vision of the Corpus Hermeticum, the chain of emanation from a transcendent one, the descent and ascent of the soul through planetary spheres, the idea that direct knowledge of God is available to the prepared human mind, the image of the cosmos as a living divine being, none of that becomes less interesting because it was written in the 2nd century instead of the 3rd millennium BCE. The date changes the authority. It does not change the ideas. The Hermetic treatises, even after Casaubon, continued to be read by Rosicrucians, by Freemasons, by the initiates of the Golden Dawn in the 1890s, by Aleister Crowley, by Carl Jung. The concept of as above, so below, which comes from the Emerald Tablet rather than the Corpus Hermeticum proper, became a shorthand for the entire Hermetic worldview. The 7-stage ascent of the soul through the planets became a template for Western initiatory ritual. The idea that the material world was created by a divine logos, a word spoken into darkness, influenced Christian theology from the Gospel of John forward, and some scholars argue the influence ran in both directions. The Hermetic idea that mind pervades all matter resurfaced in Spinoza, in the German Romantics, in the process philosophy of Whitehead. It never fully left. The 17 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum also do not stand alone. They are only the most famous portion of a much larger body of Hermetic literature that includes the Asclepius, preserved in a Latin translation attributed to Apuleius, which contains the famous lament passage where Hermes prophesies the death of Egyptian religion and the coming of a dark age. That prophecy was so vivid that Augustine quoted it at length in The City of God, and early modern readers took it as proof that Hermes had foreseen the fall of paganism. The Stobaeus fragments, excerpts preserved by the 5th century anthologist John of Stobie, add dozens more short Hermetic dialogues to the collection. And a Coptic Hermetic text found among the Nag Hammadi codices, now called the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, describes a ritual ascent through the planetary spheres in language so specific that it reads like an initiation script meant to be performed aloud. Together, these texts represent a tradition that was genuinely widespread in the ancient Mediterranean, even if it was not as ancient as Ficino believed. What Cosimo de Medici set in motion when he told Ficino to put down Plato was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential editorial decisions in intellectual history. He could not have known that. He was a dying old man who wanted to read what he believed was the oldest book in the world. Ficino could not have known it either. He was a young translator following orders. But the chain of events that followed, from the Pymander's publication in 1471 to Pico's oration in 1486 to Bruno's execution in 1600 to Casaubon's debunking in 1614, remade the intellectual landscape of Europe. The Hermetic revival helped trigger the Renaissance turn toward individual spiritual authority, toward the dignity of the human being as a divine creature. toward the idea that nature contains hidden truths, accessible through study and contemplation, rather than through priestly intermediaries alone. The Corpus Hermeticum is still in print. You can buy a Copenhagen translation in paperback. The 14 treatises Ficino, translated, plus 3 more that surfaced later, sit between 2 covers and take a few hours to read. The language is dense but not impenetrable. The cosmology is strange but internally consistent. The ethical vision that the highest human act is the direct knowledge of God, achieved through intellectual preparation and spiritual discipline, still reads as a challenge to anyone who encounters it. According to History Today, Cosimo de Medici died on the 1st of August 1464, having read Ficino's translation. Whether the words gave him what he hoped for in those final months, nobody recorded. Ficino went on to translate the complete works of Plato, then Plotinus, then a library of Neoplatonic and Orphic texts that collectively reshaped European philosophy. He outlived Cosimo by more than 3 decades. He never stopped believing that Hermes Trismegistus was a real Egyptian sage who had received divine wisdom at the beginning of time. Casaubon proved him wrong 150 years later. But by then the ideas had already done their work. They had already moved through Pico, through Bruno, through the Rosicrucians, through 2 centuries of European minds. The correction came too late to undo the effect. That is the strange arithmetic of the Corpus Hermeticum. A set of 2nd century texts, mistaken for pre-Mosaic revelation, reshaped the Renaissance because the mistake gave them an authority they would not otherwise have carried. The mistake was the fuel. Remove the false dating, and the revival might never have happened. Keep it and a man burns in Rome. Either way, the texts themselves remain, still readable, still difficult, still making the same claims they made when an anonymous writer in Roman Egypt first put stylus to papyrus and signed the name of Hermes. If you enjoyed this, there are more stories like this on the channel.